Do you want to start farming tier 17 breaches? One tap all enemies? While still being able to do this to the pinnacle bosses? Of course you do, you dirty dog. But problem is, you're too lazy to farm for gear, too broke to swipe, and even if you were to swipe, you're afraid that the blue-haired demon is going to get you in your sleep.
Get her the fuck out, standing for.
But that's not an issue, because with this build, you don't have to spend all of your life savings to get the build online. I put the build together with just a few divines, and honestly, you don't even have to spend that to start farming tier 15 maps and above. It's tanky, fun, and has a shit ton of damage. So let's cover what you need to make the build work and how it works, shall we? Starting us right off, your first question is probably, hey Mr. Paragaming Big Dick Senpai, I've seen the lightning arrow build. How does this build compare to that one? Well damn, we're rocking Ice Shot in this build. The benefits of using this are indeed substantial. Firstly, it has a massive chance to freeze, meaning you'll freeze enemies every time you shoot the thing, which in turn allows you to instantly use Herald of Ice once your enemies explode, setting off a chain reaction of explosions. Because not only will Herald of Ice explode and in turn your enemies, but using the correct support gems, you'll also keep shocking nearby enemies, which in turn allows for Herald of Thunder to start exploding as well. And with this many explosions happening on your screen, it's sure as hell hard to avoid exploding yourself, of course. So play the build at your own risk. In any way, back to Ice Shot. What else makes this skill magnificent? Well, it both provides a huge scaler from physical damage, and it's also a great AoE ability. When it comes to the scaling, it takes 70% of your physical damage and turns it into cold, allowing for instant freezes. This also allows us to completely ditch cold damage on our gear and solely focus on physical and lightning, which has yet another benefits, for example, focusing on our lightning rod damage. Because this is what we're using when deleting pinnacle bosses. It's probably the best skill in the game when it comes to dishing out as much damage as possible, and we'll utilize it to the fullest. I'll show how soon. Lightning damage is also incredibly easy to get. So easy, in fact, that all we need to make our Ice Shot shock enemies as well is to utilize the essence of the storm in the passive tree. And why would we even want to shock enemies via our Ice Shot? Didn't I just say we had Herald of Ice for that? Is that not enough to cause the huge explosions? Well, yes, partially. By getting both shock and freezes onto our enemies via our Ice Shot, it simply makes the explosions much more likely to happen. It also increases our single target damage, which we'll mainly need when we are getting pounded by solo rare enemies, for example, as on bosses, we're still utilizing Lightning Rod on bosses. In any way, that's just a bit of the basics. If you're confused to shit as to how the build works still, don't worry, that's just in the nature of PoE. I'll take it slow and easy for your stupid-ass boomer brain now, and you'll understand everything there is to know to become an expert in this build. And we'll start out with the gems. Here we have our lovely, lovely Ice Shot. Fun fact, if you remove all your projectile speed and additional projectiles, this skill looks like busting a nut. Anyhow, for the first gem, I'm using Cold Penetration. We're stacking a buttload of lightning penetration in the passive tree as to nuke the living shit out of bosses via our lightning rod, but we're severely lacking the cold penetration. And as the game currently lacks enough support gems to efficiently stack damage on 4 different damage abilities as we're using in this build, we need to spread them out wherever we can. Furthermore, we're also using Heft here. This thing is actually bonkers for Ice Shot, as it has an incredible physical damage scaling. We then have Rising Tempest, further boosting our damage per elemental type, where we are focusing on lightning and cold. And finally, Primal Armament, for the Big Dam. And Big Dam equals Big Dick. That's just a fact. Now, if you have any issues whatsoever with mana when you're mapping, it's easily solved. You just take Inspiration here and swap it over to Ice Shot. The reason I have it on Lightning Rod is simple. It's the only perfect Jeweler's Orb I've found yet. Ideally, though, you either have it on your Ice Shot when mapping or cast on Shock further down when bossing. More on that later, because now we have our actual Lightning Rod. There's a lot of confusion as to how this fucking thing actually works, but it's rather simple. You drop it down, and it deals a bit of damage via a lightning burst. The same lightning bursts can, however, be triggered by skills that chain. For example, Orb of Storms. It clearly states that it causes chaining. Lightning Balls is another skill that does this, even though it doesn't explicitly say so, and in turn also chains onto the lightning rods, making them deal additional damage. For our lightning rod, we just want it to deal as much damage as possible on single target. Scatter Shot allows it to dish out additional projectiles. Concentrated Effect is used for more damage and in turn less AoE, which we don't give a shit about on single target. When we're deleting bosses, we want to stand close as to utilize the Close Combat Gem for a huge damage multiplier. And finally, we have Martial Tempo for additional attack speed, and I'm currently rocking Inspiration, which I would much rather have on my cast on Shock or Ice Shot. Alright, and next up is Orb of Storms. This is a lovely skill due to the chaining it provides. Dropping down a few lightning rods and an Orb of Storms is enough to kill any boss while mapping, and it's only on pinnacle bosses you should turn on your cast on Shock, as it otherwise just wastes a bunch of mana. Now we don't give two shits about the damage of Orb of Storms, but we do care about how many times it chains. Due to this, you want a high-level Orb of Storms, but only if you can use it without running out of mana. Otherwise, go with a lower one. To cause further chains, we use Chain in combination with Overabundance to get an additional Orb of Storms. But having to use 2 Orbs of Storms is annoying. Hell, we need to save our carpal tunnel fingers. So due to this, we're also combining it with Unleash to spawn them both at once. Pretty great. And finally, Font of Rage. Standing within your Orb of Storms and using this, you can in turn grant yourself a bunch of Rage, up to 30 if you don't stack maximum Rage. This will in turn grant you 30% big fucking damage. Okay, and when the hell would we even use this? Standing within the orb sounds annoying as hell? Yeah, but you can stack it up before you blow a pinnacle boss to pieces, or even a map boss. It's insanely strong. Alright, and for our next gem, we have the Almighty cast on Shock, as previously stated. I'm only turning this on when doing pinnacle bosses because it's completely useless when mapping. My gear is dogshit, and I don't need it when mapping ever. It just drains your mana when it's fully charges. For pinnacle bosses, however, it's mandatory. And how does this gem work then? Well, that's easy. You shock enemies, which in turn lets you gather energy, and then you unleash your ball of lightning, and in this case, Orb of Winter. What's cool about this combo is that the skills that are here can't contribute to your cast on Shock and make it go haywire. But your balls of lightning can trigger lightning rods, which causes a buttload of shocks when triggered. This in turn allows you to stack up cast on Shock, cast a bunch of balls again, and shock via lightning rod. A lovely chain of events that will make your damage skyrocket. To gain additional energy, we then have Impetus and Energy Retention. For the Orb of Winter, and yes, I know it's called Eye of Winter, but it looks like a flying ball sack, we are using this to boost our crit chance. You gain a total of 10% base crit chance using this white ball-looking asshole, granting you a total of 15% base crit chance, as it's by default 5 and 16 when we're done with the passive tree. This is a substantial DPS increase on bosses, only if you manage to stack the stat Increased Critical Hit Chance. And why is that? Well, shit. The total crit chance is basically your base crit chance multiplied by your increased critical hit chance. So if you stack this, you can get close to 100% and in turn, a buttload of damage. And finally, the mana cost. Once you start triggering your cast on shocks, you're causing a massive chain reaction that drains 2,000 mana per second or something. To offset this, you have to get a Thief's Torment ring, or else you can't delete pinnacle bosses. On top of that, you should use either Inspiration, or you may have to remove the Orb of Winter, as it costs just way too much mana. Okay? And next we have Grim Feast and Wind Dancer. I'm always using these when mapping, and turning them off when doing pinnacle bosses. By playing Pac-Man and picking up Grim Remnants, which happens automatically, don't worry, you gain Energy Shield. This can overcharge, doubling it, and giving it to the next person. And to make us tanky as hell, I've created a passive tree focusing heavily on this stat as to stay alive. The support gems here are pretty shit and not mandatory at all. You can remove them if you lack the spirit, as I'm simply using cannibalism for a bit of additional life regen in combination with herbalism. For Wind Dancer, we're rocking it to gain evasion, simple as that, and to boost it, I'm using clarity here as to gain the mana regen. Other somewhat useful support gems are Maim and Blind for a slight bonus in defensives when we are getting our ass pounded in close range. But I'm lazy and would have to turn off both Grim Feast and Wind Dancer doing this when I want to swap to cast on Shock. So I'm just leaving these shitty gems in the bag for now. Alright? And then we have Voltaic Mark. We use this only on bosses, increasing our shock chance along with magnitude, meaning we gain additional shock value from it. I'm then grabbing Persistence as to keep it up longer and Arcane Tempo because why the hell not? It makes it a bit faster to cast. And then finally, the Herald Wombo combo with Herald of Ice and Thunder. Understanding this is quite important because every goddamn build is using them. And with this tech, you're able to make them trigger off each other, and we're able to do it by doing this. First, we socket Cold Infusion. This in turn makes Herald of Thunder deal cold damage, and it's now able to freeze. And when enemies are frozen, Herald of Ice is able to trigger. We then do the same thing with Herald of Ice, but for the shock. We use Lightning Infusion, which turns Herald of Ice also into a lightning skill. And it's now able to shock. Doing this allows Herald of Thunder to trigger, which in turn triggers Herald of Ice, and yeah, you know how it works by now. We then boost our Herald of Thunder by granting it additional freeze buildup via glaciation. Ice Bite is an interesting one as well. As we'll freeze enemies via Herald of Thunder, we're boosting all of our damage with additional cold damage, making it even easier to freeze. And then finally, Long Shot, a great gem, as the skill is mainly clearing off screen. For our Herald of Ice, we wanted to trigger additional shocks, so we use Conduction along with Innovate to grant us lightning damage when we shock enemies, and finally, Magnified Effect to boost our AoE clearing capabilities. Holy my man or woman, you still here? Nicely done. Take a break if you have to, grab a beer, a snack, bust a nut perhaps, and we'll continue onwards with the gear, both what I'm using and what you would ideally want. Starting us off, what gear should you prioritize when it comes to spending your precious divines, or rather exalts, you fucking noob? I'd say focus on the bow and quiver first, and then save up for a hand of wisdom and action. It doesn't have to be a good pair, and you should be able to get a pair for 3 divines, and it's bonkers due to the lightning damage it provides. For the bow, try to focus on getting as much DPS as possible, along with preferably projectile skill ranks and an extra projectile. The life here is complete dogshit, and you may as well ditch the cold damage to make it cheaper, as most people are running cold here for the lightning arrow build. For gems, either use these crit gems or the cheapest option, physical damage bonus. And on your quiver, the same goes here as on your bow. You simply want as much damage modifiers as possible. This thing is really dog shit though, because you absolutely want projectile speed here, and preferably projectile skill ranks again. The reason your quiver is so important is due to master fletching in the passive skills. It literally doubles its value, and when it comes to projectile speed, it both makes your ice shot smoother, and it provides you with a direct damage increase via feathered fletching down here. Other than that though, Dex or Int is the name of the game where you want as much intelligence as possible, and enough dexterity to actually use your gear. Oh, and mana on kill is also useful, but having mana leech is also goated as hell, which I'm rocking on my rings. And speaking of rings, here they are. This is where we start stacking up as much defensives as possible. Max life is your best friend, and so is capping your resistances. Other than that, you have a choice. Go for as much damage as possible to nuke shit, or go for item rarity stacking if you want to get as much loot as possible. Next up, we have the armor. This is the easiest by far. Just get a fuckton of defensives, max life, resistances, and a bunch of evasion and energy shield. The only things you actually need to know here is that to actually use your skills, you at least need a good spirit roll on either your amulet or chest. You don't have to get it on both, as you can just keep moving your gems around, but it's useful as to save you some time. The other important thing was that of the helm and chest. Because in the passive skills, you have Subterfuge Mask, which grants double the evasion rating of your helmet energy shield, simply meaning you need to get a bunch of energy shield on your helm because Triple G will double it and grant it to your evasion. And for your chest, you do the absolute opposite. You only want evasion here because Bestial Skin will double it for you. Alright, I think that's all you need to know about the gear. I also have a shield on because it's badass, and in the written guide, I'll have some slight tweaks to the gear as to make it more optimal rather than the shit I'm using. Hey, will you look at the time? It's already passive tree, a fucking clock, and you know it, baby, let's check it out, shall we? For the Ascendancy, it's the typical setup. Point blank as to nuke bosses close up, and endless munitions for the extra projectile. We then have Tailwind, of course, for the cast and movement speed, along with evasion. After that, it's time to start picking up all of these lovely damage nodes, dex and ailment generation, or in other words, shock and freeze generation. As we're progressing, we grab some dex and strength, and I've already mentioned this before, but I'll do it again just for the sake of it. Only grab enough dex and strength to use your gems and bow. The rest should be spent on Int for the gloves, assuming you have them, and if you don't have them, well, I don't know what to tell you. Oh wait, I do. Go get them, you fucking loser. Next, it's time for Master Fletching, which is actually insane, allowing with a bunch of lightning penetration and damage. We then go for a couple different routes. Let's start by heading off to Narnia and check out these nodes here. Here we find all of our defensive nodes, granting us evasion and energy shield. If you're a big boy, then sure go ahead and skip them for more damage, but I promise you, you will die. A lot, and that's no fun. I do want to mention, however, that I decided to anoint Essence of the Storm onto my amulet here. This passive is insanely important, and you actually must have it for this build to function. But you do not actually want to anoint it. I just did it for the sake of this video and due to it being cheap. Ideally, if you can afford it, then you go for Wildstorm for 15% damage. That's what I'll get when I make an ultra endgame version of the build. Next, we check out the nodes here in the middle parts, where we find a bunch of shock and freeze generation via Unbound Forces and Falcon Technique to gain attack speed via Dex. We also grab a bunch of gems wherever we can, where you want to prio quiver bonuses first, which is unfortunately also the most expensive. You then follow that up with projectile speed, elemental damage, and crit chance. After that, it's time to head off to fucking Uganda or whatever, pick up a bunch of defensives along the way, some crit chance in heart-stopping, and struck through until we get to feathered fletching. This thing is massive, providing a bunch of additive damage for us, seeing as projectile speed is such an easy stat to get, and it also makes clearing faster when your ice shots doesn't take half a year to reach their targets. It's then to head down to our favorite nodes down here. And it's our favorite nodes because Lightning Rod can be found here, massively boosting our damage. It works simply by granting your Lightning Rods 2 chances to deal damage and then grabbing the highest of those 2 hits. It's a spectacular node. Hell, you could anoint it if you want and skip all of these nodes, but that's extra work for you and not a great choice seeing how good these nodes are. Now, if you have good gear and manage to get your crit chance to 50% or so, then you can indeed ditch this passive as it only works on non-crits. But if you're anywhere close to my gear, then chances are you won't crit that much, especially not when mapping, making this node incredible. Lightning damage, lightning penetration, and a bunch of damage and crowd control. Yeah, these nodes are pretty damn good as well. And that, my friends, are the passives. Nice, huh? Yeah. Let's do the playing section now, where I teach you not to suck at the game. And then I'll leave you to do whatever the hell you want. When mapping, it's easy peasy. All you do is press your ice shot and run around killing things. It's just that simple. If there's something you can't kill, then you can 1, get good, or 2, start spamming out some lightning rods and an orb of storms. This will for sure kill them, and should be enough on map bosses as well. For pinnacle bosses, however, you need to turn on a few of those brain cells of yours. Because now, we want to kill this thing as fast as humanly possible. If you watch my lightning arrow video, then you know how to do this though, because it's literally the same everything. Same gems, same setup, and all that good stuff. If you have any issues one-shotting the pinnacle bosses, then I can highly recommend doing what is called the YouTuber. It works simply by you running back to Doriani, changing passives for full damage, and create a clickbait thumbnail about how you're dealing millions of damage. Works as a charm, and it kills the boss insanely fast. You then want to make sure that you've got your cast on shock toggled on. What gems you use in your cast on shock will depend, as we talked about earlier, mainly depending on your mana generation. Your Thief's Torment should be slotted into your ring spot as well. It's then time to stack up that rage standing within your orb of storms. You then simply drag it along with you to the boss. Once there, you just want to make sure to keep it up, throw a voltaic mark on him, and blow up his sorry ass with lightning rod spamming. Just keep doing this, and the boss should be dead soon enough. And that, my friends, is the Ice Shot Ranger build. Let me know what build you want to see next, and until then, have a good one.